Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Marx's Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 20, Time Wages from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 20 is the second chapter of 4 in Part 6 of 8 of Kapital Volume 1, Wages. The last chapter, Chapter 19, was an introduction to this section in which Marx examined some of the classical political economy which was defending capitalism and criticized those thinkers for failing to discover in their investigations how the capitalist mode of production uses the wage form of labor to obscure exploitation. In other words, it tries to make it look as though the laborer is paid for all of the labor that they perform, when in reality, part of the working day is necessary labor, which does go back to the worker in the form of wages, but then necessarily also in capitalism, there is an additional portion of the working day, surplus labor, which creates surplus value, which is the basis of profit, and that just goes to the capitalist for free. So in this chapter on time wages, which discusses wages which are paid to the worker corresponding to increments of time, whether it's by the hour or the day or the week, whatever. And then the next chapter, 21, is going to discuss another major form of wages, piece wages, by which workers are paid by the number of widgets or whatever else that they produce. We talked about piece wages back in chapter 15 when we were talking about the children who were crammed into the rooms with very little space working on the lace and the straw plaiting. In any case, no matter the form that the wages take, Marx's point is that wages in general disguise the exploitation of labor. And we discussed this back in some of the very early chapters of this book, in which we contrasted what is recognized under the capitalist system as wage theft, in which, for example, it's recognized that you worked 8 hours, but you only get paid for 7. And, that's something that you can report these days to your local Department of Labor and try to get remedy. But Marx's point is that there's a bigger point, not just wage theft, but the exploitation of labor in general. That what you're being paid for those 8 hours, even if it's legal and above board, is actually a small fraction of the value that you produced during your shift. The rest, again, going to the capitalist for free. That being one of the main topics, Marx is also going to delve into finer supporting points about differences in the rate of exploitation, which may be concealed by time wages, and also how this can give rise to competition between workers. Let's begin. Wages themselves again take many forms, a fact not recognizable in the ordinary economic treatises which, exclusively interested in the material side of the question, neglect every difference of form. An exposition of all these forms, however, belongs to the special study of wage labor, not therefore to this work. Still, the two fundamental forms must be briefly worked out here. The sale of labor power, as will be remembered, takes place for a definite period of time. The converted form under which the daily, weekly, etc. value of labor power presents itself is hence that of time wages, therefore day wages, etc. Next, it is to be noted that the laws set forth in the 17th chapter on the changes in the relative magnitudes of price of labor power and surplus value pass by a simple transformation of form into laws of wages. Similarly, the distinction between the exchange value of labor power and the sum of the necessaries of life into which this value is converted now reappears as the distinction between nominal and real wages. It would be useless to repeat here, with regard to the phenomenal form, what has already been worked out in the substantial form. We limit ourselves, therefore, to a few points characteristic of time wages. The sum of money, and for the purpose of this discussion the value of the money itself is always supposed to be constant, which the laborer receives for their daily or weekly labor, forms the amount of their nominal wages, or of their wages estimated in value. But it is clear that according to the length of the working day, that is, according to the amount of actual labor daily supplied, the same daily or weekly wage may represent very different prices of labor, i.e. very different sums of money for the same quantity of labor. Footnote quoting Sir Edward West's Price of Corn and Wages of Labor, 1836, the price of labor is the sum paid for a given quantity of labor, unquote. West is the author of the anonymous Essay on the Application of Capital to Land by a Fellow of the University College of Oxford, London, 1815, an epoch-making work in the history of political economy. Back to the main text. We must therefore, in considering time wages, again distinguish between the sum total of the daily or weekly wages, etc., and the price of labor. How then to find this price, i.e. the money value of a given quantity of labor? The average price of labor is found when the average daily value of the labor power is divided by the average number of hours in the working day. If, for example, the daily value of labor power is 3 shillings, the value of the product of 6 working hours, and if the working day is 12 hours, the price of 1 working hour is 3/12 shillings, or 3 pence. The price of the working hour thus found serves as the unit measure for the price of labor. It follows, therefore, that the daily and weekly wages, etc., may remain the same, although the price of labor falls constantly. If, for example, the habitual working day is 10 hours and the daily value of the labor power 3 shillings, the price of the working hour is 3 3/5 pence. It falls to 3 pence as soon as the working day rises to 12 hours, to 2 2/5 pence as soon as it rises to 15 hours. Daily or weekly wages remain, despite all this, unchanged. On the contrary, the daily or weekly wages may rise, although the price of labor remains constant, or even falls. If, for example, the working day is 10 hours and the daily value of labor power is 3 shillings, the price of 1 working hour is 3 3/5 pence. If the laborer, in consequence of increase of trade, works 12 hours, the price of labor remaining the same, their daily wage now rises to 3 shillings 7 1/5 pence without any variation in the price of labor. The same result might follow if, instead of the extensive amount of labor, its intensive amount increased. Comment: the extensive amount meaning the extent of the working day, the total number of hours. The intensity being the amount of labor performed within that amount of time. Continuing, we have a footnote, quoting West, same source: the wages of labor depend upon the price of labor and the quantity of labor performed. An increase in the wages of labor does not necessarily imply an enhancement of the price of labor. From fuller employment and greater exertions, there's the intensity, the wages of labor may be considerably increased, while the price of labor may continue the same, unquote. The main question, how is the price of labor determined, West, however, dismisses with mere banalities. Back to the main text. The rise of the nominal, daily, or weekly wages may therefore be accompanied by a price of labor that remains stationary or falls. The same holds as to the income of the laborer's family as soon as the quantity of labor expended by the head of the family is increased by the labor of the members of their family. There are therefore methods of lowering the price of labor independent of the reduction of the nominal, daily, or weekly wages. Footnote: this is perceived by the fanatical representative of the industrial bourgeoisie of the 18th century, the author of the Essay on Trade and Commerce often quoted by us, although he puts the matter in a confused way. Quote, "It is the quantity of labor and not the price of it." Marx adds he means by this the nominal, daily, or weekly wages, quote, "that is determined by the price of provisions and other necessaries. Reduce the price of necessaries very low, and of course you reduce the quantity of labor in proportion. Master manufacturers know that there are various ways of raising and felling the price of labor, besides that of altering its nominal amount," unquote. In his 3 lectures on the rate of wages, London, 1830, in which N.W. Sr. uses West's work without mentioning it, he says, quote, "The laborer is principally interested in the amount of wages," unquote. That is to say, the laborer is principally interested in what they receive, the nominal sum of their wages, not in that which they give, the amount of labor. Back to the main text. As a general law, it follows that, given the amount of daily or weekly labor, etc., the daily or weekly wages depend on the price of labor, which itself varies either with the value of labor power or with the difference between its price and its value. Given, on the other hand, the price of labor, the daily or weekly wages depend on the quantity of the daily or weekly labor. The unit measure for time wages, the price of the working hour, is the quotient of the value of a day's labor power divided by the number of hours of the average working day. Let the latter be 12 hours, and the daily value of labor power 3 shillings, the value of the product of 6 hours of labor. Under these circumstances, the price of a working hour is 3 pence. The value produced in it is 6 pence. If the laborer is now employed less than 12 hours, or less than 6 days in the week, for example, only 6 or 8 hours, they receive, with this price of labor, only 2 shillings or 1 shilling 6 pence a day. Footnote: the effect of such an abnormal lessening of employment is quite different from that of a general reduction of the working day enforced by law. The former has nothing to do with the absolute length of the working day, and may occur just as well in a working day of 15 as of 6 hours. The normal price of labor is in the first case calculated on the laborer working 15 hours, in the second case on their working 6 hours a day on the average. The result is therefore the same if they, in the one case, are employed only for 7.5, in the other only for 3 hours. Back to the main text. As on our hypothesis, they must work on the average 6 hours daily in order to produce a day's wage corresponding merely to the value of their labor power. As according to the same hypothesis, they work only half of every hour for themselves and half for the capitalist. It is clear that they cannot obtain for themselves the value of the product of 6 hours if they are employed less than 12 hours. In previous chapters, we saw the destructive consequences of overwork. Here we find the sources of the sufferings that result to the laborer from their insufficient employment. If the hour's wage is fixed so that the capitalist does not bind themselves to pay a day's or a week's wage, but only to pay wages for the hours during which they choose to employ the laborer, they can employ them for a shorter time than that which is originally the basis of the calculation of the hour wage, or the unit measure of the price of labor. Since this unit is determined by the ratio daily value of labor power divided by the working day of a given number of hours, it does of course lose all meaning as soon as the working day ceases to contain a definite number of hours. The connection between the paid and the unpaid labor is destroyed. The capitalist can now wring from the labor a certain quantity of surplus labor without allowing them the labor time necessary for their own subsistence. The capitalist can annihilate all regularity of employment and, according to their own convenience, caprice, and the interest of the moment, make the most enormous overwork alternate with relative or absolute cessation of work. The capitalist can, under the pretense of paying the quote, normal price of labor, abnormally lengthen the working day without any corresponding compensation to the laborer. Hence the perfectly rational revolt in 1860 of the London laborers, employed in the building trades, against the attempt of the capitalists to impose on them this sort of wage by the hour. The legal limitation of the working day puts an end to such mischief, although not, of course, to the diminution of employment caused by the competition of machinery, by changes in the quality of the laborers employed, and by crises, partial or general. Comment, and remember, by crises, he means what we would basically call recessions today. Continuing. With an increasing daily or weekly wage, the price of labor may remain nominally constant and yet fall below its normal level. This occurs every time that the price of labor, reckoned by working hour, remaining constant, the working day is prolonged beyond its customary length. If in the fraction daily value of labor power divided by working day, the denominator increases, meaning length of the working day, the numerator, the daily value of labor power, increases yet more rapidly. The value of labor power, as dependent on its wear and tear, increases with the duration of its functioning, and in more rapid proportion than the increase of that duration. In many branches of industry where time wage is the general rule, without legal limits to the working time, the habit has therefore spontaneously grown up of regarding the working day as normal only up to a certain point, e.g. up to the expiration of the 10th hour. Quote, normal working day, quote, the day's work, quote, the regular hours of work. Beyond this limit, the working time is overtime, and is, taking the hour as unit measure, paid better, extra pay, although often in a proportion ridiculously small. Footnote, quote, the rate of payment for overtime in lace making is so small, and this is quoting the Child's Employment Commission Report number 2, from 1/2 pence and 3/4 pence to 2 pence per hour, that it stands in painful contrast to the amount of injury produced to the health and stamina of the workpeople. The small amount thus earned is also often obliged to be spent in extra nourishment, unquote. Back to the main text. The normal working day exists here as a fraction of the actual working day, and the latter, often during the whole year, lasts longer than the former. Footnote, for example, in paper staining before the recent introduction into this trade of the Factory Act. Quoting Mr. Smith's evidence in Child Employment Commission first report, we work on with no stoppage for meals so that the day's work of 10.5 hours is finished by 4:30 p.m. and all after that is overtime, and we seldom leave off working before 6 p.m. so that we are really working overtime the whole year round. Unquote. Back to the main text. The increase in the price of labor with the extension of the working day beyond a certain normal limit takes such a shape in various British industries that the low price of labor during the so-called normal time compels the laborer to work during the better paid overtime if they wish to obtain a sufficient wage at all. Footnote, for example, in the Scotch bleaching works, quote, in some parts of Scotland, this trade, Marx adds, before the introduction of the Factory Act in 1862, quote, was carried on by a system of overtime, i.e. 10 hours a day were the regular hours of work for which a nominal wage of 1 shilling 2 pence per day was paid to a man, there being every day overtime for 3 or 4 hours, paid at the rate of 3 shillings per hour. The effect of this system was a man could not earn more than 8 shillings per week when working the ordinary hours. Without overtime, they could not earn a fair day's wages. Unquote. That's from the Report of Inspector of Factories, April 30, 1863. Quoting the same report, April 30, 1848, the higher wages for getting adult males to work longer hours are a temptation too strong to be resisted. Unquote. The bookbinding trade in the city of London employs very many young girls from 14 to 15 years old, and that under indentures which prescribe certain definite hours of labor. Nevertheless, they work in the last week of each month until 10, 11, 12, or 1 o'clock at night, along with the older laborers in a very mixed company. Quoting the Children's Employment Commission 5th Report, the masters tempt them by extra pay and supper, which they eat in neighboring public houses. The great debauchery thus produced among these young immortals is compensated by the fact that among the rest many Bibles and religious books are bound by them. Ha ha. Back to the main text. Legal limitation of the working day puts an end to these amenities. Footnote, see Report of Inspector of Factories, 30 April, 1863. With very accurate appreciation of the state of things, the London laborers employed in the building trades declared, during the Great Strike and Lockout of 1860, that they would only accept wages by the hour under 2 conditions. 1. That with the price of the working hour, a normal working day of 9 and 10 hours, respectively, should be fixed, and that the price of the hour for the 10 hours working day should be higher than that for the hour of the 9 hours working day. And 2, that every hour beyond the normal working day should be reckoned as overtime and proportionally more highly paid. Back to the main text. It is a fact generally known that the longer the working days in any branch of industry, the lower are the wages. Footnote, quoting the Report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1863, it is a very notable thing, too, that where long hours are the rule, small wages are also so. And quoting the Public Health 6th Report, 1864, the work which obtains the scanty pittance of food is, for the most part, excessively prolonged. Back to the main text. A. Redgrave, factory inspector, illustrates this by a comparative review of the 20 years from 1839 to 59, according to which wages rose in the factories under the 10 hours law, while they fell in the factories in which the work lasted 14 to 15 hours daily. From the law, the price of labor being given, the daily or weekly wage depends on the quantity of labor expended. It follows first of all that the lower the price of labor, the greater must be the quantity of labor, or the longer must be the working day for the laborer to secure even a miserable average wage. The lowness of the price of labor acts here as a stimulus to the extension of the labor time. Footnote, the hand nail makers in England, for example, have, on account of the low price of labor, to work 15 hours a day in order to hammer out, no pun intended, their miserable weekly wage. Quote, it's a great many hours in the day, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., and he has to work hard all the time to get 11 pence or 1 shilling. And there's the wear of the tools, the cost of firing, and something for waste iron to go out of this, which takes off altogether 2.5 pence or 3 pence. That's quoting the Children's Employment Commission 3rd Report. The women earn by the same working time a week's wage of only 5 shillings. Back to the main text. On the other hand, the extension of the working time produces, in its turn, a fall in the price of labor, and with this a fall in the day's or week's wages. The determination of the price of labor by daily value of labor power divided by working day of a given number of hours shows that a mere prolongation of the working day lowers the price of labor, if no compensation steps in. But the same circumstances which allow the capitalist in the long run to prolong the working day also allow them first, and compel them finally, to nominally lower the price of labor until the total price of the increased number of hours is lowered, and therefore the daily or weekly wage. Reference to 2 circumstances is sufficient here. If one man does the work of 1.5 or 2 men, the supply of labor increases, although the supply of labor power on the market remains constant. The competition thus created between the laborers allows the capitalist to beat down the price of labor, while the falling price of labor allows them, on the other hand, to screw up still further the working time. Footnote, if a factory hand, for example, refused to work the customary long hours, quote, he would very shortly be replaced by somebody who would work any length of time and thus be thrown out of employment. That's quoting the Report of Inspector of Factories, 30 April, 1848. And quoting Senior, if one man performs the work of two, the rate of profits will generally be raised, in consequence of the additional supply of labor having diminished its price. Unquote, back to the main text. Soon, however, this command over abnormal quantities of unpaid labor, i.e. quantities in excess of the average social amount, becomes a source of competition among the capitalists themselves. A part of the price of the commodity consists of the price of labor. The unpaid part of the labor price need not be reckoned in the price of the commodity. It may be presented to the buyer. This is the first step to which competition leads. The second step to which it drives is to exclude also from the selling price of the commodity at least a part of the abnormal surplus value created by the extension of the working day. In this way, an abnormally low selling price of the commodity arises, at first sporadically, and becomes fixed by degrees. A lower selling price, which henceforward becomes the constant basis of a miserable wage for an excessive working time, as originally it was the product of these very circumstances. This movement is simply indicated here, as the analysis of competition does not belong to this part of our subject. Nevertheless, the capitalist may, for a moment, speak for themselves. Quote, in Birmingham, there is so much competition of masters one against another, that many are obliged to do things as employers that they would otherwise be ashamed of, and yet no more money is made, but only the public gets the benefit. That quote is from the Children's Employment Third Commission report. The reader will remember the two sorts of London bakers, of whom one sold the bread at its full price, the full-priced bakers, the other below its normal price, the underpriced or undersellers. The full-priced denounced their rivals before the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry. Quote, they only exist now by first defrauding the public, and next getting 18 hours work out of their men for 12 hours wages. The unpaid labor of the men was made the source whereby the competition was carried on, and continues so to this day. The competition among the master bakers is the cause of the difficulty in getting rid of night work. An underseller who sells his bread below the cost price according to the price of flour must make it up by getting more out of the labor of the men. If I got only 12 hours work out of my men, and my neighbor got 18 or 20, he must beat me in the selling price. If the men could insist on payment for overwork, this would be set right. A large number of those employed by the undersellers are foreigners and youths. The more things change, the more they stay the same, who are obliged to accept almost any wages they can obtain. That's quoting from the report, etc., relative to the grievances complained of by the journeyman bakers, London, 1862. And Marx adds, anyhow, the full-priced bakers, as was mentioned above, and as their spokesman Bennett himself admits, makes their men, quote, generally begin work at 11 p.m. up to 8 o'clock the next morning. They are then engaged all day long, as late as 7 o'clock in the evening, unquote. Back to the main text. This Jeremiad is also interesting because it shows how the appearance only of the relations of production mirrors itself in the brain of the capitalist. The capitalist does not know that the normal price of labor also includes a definite quantity of unpaid labor, and that this very unpaid labor is the normal source of their gain. Comment, so, among other things, they go on thinking that all this is fair and right. Continuing, the category of surplus labor time does not exist at all for them, since it is included in the normal working day, which the capitalist thinks they've paid for in the day's wages. But overtime does exist for them, the prolongation of the working day beyond the limits corresponding with the usual price of labor. Face to face with their underselling competitor, they even insist upon extra pay for this overtime. They again do not know that this extra pay includes unpaid labor, just as well as does the price of the customary hour of labor. For example, the price of 1 hour of the 12 hours working day is 3 pence, say the value product of half a working hour, whilst the price of the overtime working hour is 4 pence, or the value product of 2/3 of a working hour. In the first case, the capitalist appropriates to themselves 1/2. In the second, 1/3 of the working hour without paying for it. Comment, in other words, no matter if you're getting overtime or not, you're still not getting the full value that you produced as long as you're doing it in the capitalist shop. And that is the end of Chapter 20. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful and allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support, so thank you very much. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-life political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.